40 years of China's opening and reform. I look back, remembering the changes. In 1981, I came here as a student. I became a lawyer and economist, working with China ever since. I advised foreign investors entering China and worked with the Chinese government, drafting the regulations that made it happen. In the 1990s, with globalization, I helped China reform state-owned enterprises, turning them into multinational corporations that would compete on the global stage. In the past decades, I advised on environmental policy that would help China become the world's leader on renewable energy. I have not just observed, but also participated in each stage of China's reform and opening. Now, it's time to tell the story of these past 40 years of reform and opening that has made China the global economy that it is today. It is not about looking back, but learning how we got here and looking toward the future that we will create together. Join me, Laurence Brahm, for China, 40 years of reform and opening, and marathon talks with behind-the-scenes stories from the experts and innovators who are the change that China will be. China, Reform and Opening, 40 Years in Perspective. Hi, I'm Laurence Brahm.
Hi, I'm Yang Xinmeng, and this is the final episode of our live streaming marathon.
This is the end of our program?
Yeah, time flies, right?
It's been going by so quickly, and we're coming to you from central Beijing.
Yes, so we'd like to thank Huangting Restaurant in the Peninsula Hotel for offering such a cozy, nice place.
Now, after 10 episodes, what are we going to do the morning after?
Well, I don't know, probably another 40 episodes of the future?
40 episodes of the future. You know, on China, Reform and Opening, 40 years in perspective, we've been covering a whole spectrum of issues, from political, economic reform to technology, values, youth, and now it's time for us in our last episode to look to the future.
Well, here's a video, the change in the world.
In the years since the Second World War, and especially during the past 2 decades, the forces of globalization have changed the world in many ways. The world is becoming flat through globalized trade, outsourcing and supply chaining. The advance of technology is making the world smaller and closer. Benefiting from globalization, China has now become the world's largest trading nation. China is also a major contributor to globalization, especially since its reform and opening up in 1978. However, globalization has been facing serious challenges of late.
The United Kingdom is leaving the European Union.
The United States is officially withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council.
From the Iran nuclear deal. From the Paris Climate Accord. We're going to terminate the agreement. We're going to pull out.
Some even say we may be witnessing its demise.
Every other nation on earth protects its own interests. America is finally going to do the same. America first. We will not allow other nations to take advantage of us any longer.
Where are we now? Are we standing at a crossroads? And what's next for globalization?
China, Reform and Opening, 40 years in perspective. And today, as we look to the future and the next 40 years, we've got an incredible lineup of guests covering international relations, multilateralism, technology for the environment, the new digital future of China, and trade.
First, I'd like to introduce UN Resident Coordinator Nicholas Rosalini. Welcome.
Thank you.
Nicholas. Now, you've had a number of interesting postings around China. I think you've been in Pakistan, Vietnam, Myanmar, is that correct? Thailand?
Yes.
Now,
China.
You've been in all the border countries around China. How does it feel to be here in Beijing?
It feels great. I mean, having worked a long time in the United Nations, having worked in countries that border China, I mean, it just brings home how vast China is as a country, not just its population, but its land area. And now having the opportunity to actually live and work in China, to add to my other experiences, it's a fascinating time to be here.
Now,
Things are changing so much.
It's a very interesting time because we have an era here where in Washington the White House is kind of pulling back from the UN and cutting funding from organizations like UNESCO. But you have China really trying to work through the multilateral framework that the UN offers. So for you, as UN representative coordinator, you must be in a very unique position to drive that process.
Yes, I mean, globalization has brought a lot of benefits to the world, and I'm sure some of your other guests have talked about that. But I mean, we've seen hundreds of millions of people around the world, including in China, of course, benefit from the economic expansion following globalization. And certainly for the UN, we believe that multilateral engagement is really important, not just for the economy of the world, but also for the peace and security of the world. And we see China engaging very strongly with the United Nations, both in terms of peace and security, as well as in terms of global challenges, global issues such as climate change, and importantly also supporting development around the world. It is now a big provider of development support to other countries through South-South cooperation.
And if I recall, there, of course, was many years ago, the UN office in Beijing, the mission, began something called Silk Road Cities way back before we even talked about Belt and Road. And now, if I understand it, you are actually have launched and you're going to be chairing the Silk and Spice Road dialogues. What's your vision for that?
Well, we need as many platforms as possible in the world to connect countries. We need, of course, the United Nations as the largest multilateral platform, but the more we can encourage regional connectivity and interregional connectivity, I think the better it is in terms of world peace and in terms of economic development.
Nicholas Rossellini from the UN in Beijing, connecting people for world peace. And who's our next guest?
Next, we have Mark Collins Chan, founder and CEO from Oceanix. Welcome.
Now, Mark, you're from Tahiti, French Polynesia. And actually, we go back to those days at the Law of the Sea Institute when it was at the University of Hawaii when I was living in Hawaii. And now you're in China. So, I mean, what are you doing here?
Well, first of all, thanks, Laurence, for this invitation and having such a distinguished panel. I'm very happy to be in Beijing. You couldn't have chosen a better day. It's beautiful out there, and it's wonderful to be back in Beijing. So my family's originally from China, but fourth generation in French Polynesia, in Tahiti. And I served as, so I've always been an entrepreneur. You know, when you have a Chinese mother, you learn very early on that you work for no one, you are an entrepreneur. So the story starts with my great-grandfather leaving China in 1896. So this is when the U.S. was building the railroad. And so the family sends him from Shenzhen all the way to San Francisco, and he ends up going to Tahiti. So in Tahiti, I've been in entrepreneurship all my life until I was invited to be part of a government. So I've got the perspective also of government officials who have to, I was Minister of Tourism, so I was in charge, for example, on the opening with China. The whole idea of having approved destination status with China was very important for all the countries in the Pacific. I got very involved also in all of the friendship associations. You know, China is very strong in the Pacific through these associations, opened the first one in Tahiti. But today, I'm here to talk about what I think is the future for urbanization, not only in China, but elsewhere. So globally, as you know, there's 1 million, 2 million people a week, every week, that are moving to cities. And most cities happen to be coastal cities, so that's the case here in China as well. That's putting huge, massive pressure on city governments. And what they've been doing historically, and I mean this started here in China in the 1600s, is land reclamation. So Oceanix, which is a Hong Kong-based company, what we would like to propose is that let's stop doing land reclamation for human habitation and for industries and for ports. Let's start looking at floating infrastructure, and in particular floating cities. So we're talking about entirely sustainable cities that will be floating near coastal cities instead of land reclamation. So why I'm in China. China is one of the first countries to put a very hard stop on land reclamation. So earlier, January 2018, the National Oceanic Administration said no more land reclamation. So this is a very big step. So I'm happy to talk about what I see the future.
I just want to talk about something in the past, because a lot of our audience doesn't really realize this, but there's an enormous diaspora of overseas Chinese throughout the Pacific. And Sun Yat-sen, the founder or father of modern China, actually came from Hawaii, where I'm from. And he started his early support for creating a new China for the 1911 revolution began with support from the Chinese business community in Hawaii. And I remember the last time I was in Tahiti at your house, there was this incredible picture on the wall of, was it your grandfather or great-grandfather?
It was great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather. And how important is the Chinese community in Tahiti in terms of the business? And a second side of that question is, I believe you've recently been back to your ancestral home in, is it Shenzhen?
It's in Shenzhen. It's now been absorbed, so now it's within Shenzhen. Yes. So, yes, that was a picture of, in 1962, if I'm not mistaken. My great-grandfather got all the family together, and there had been a long history of sending, but this is the case for all overseas Chinese families, which was supporting the family back on the motherland and sending money back, and that's always been remembered. It hasn't been forgotten. So I consider myself an overseas Chinese entrepreneur, but coming back to China because the opportunities, beyond the opportunities, I think it's the fact that you've got a government that's willing to take some of these big picture ideas and the risks necessary to get there. And I'm happy, and I think this is going to be where the first floating city is going to be in the world.
The first floating city in the world will be here in China.
Somewhere on the coast. There's 18,000 kilometers of coastline, so somewhere in China.
Wow, coming from overseas Chinese from Tahiti who's going to be solving environmental problems here in China.
Well, the reason it was important for me in Tahiti was we've got a lot of low-lying atolls, which are these islands that are going to be submerged within 30 to 100 years. So it's really a matter of survival for a lot of these islands. It may not be for a large country like China, but for some of these smaller island nations, we're talking really survival. I mean, in the next 30, 40 years, the UN's going to have all sorts of issues with climate refugees knocking on your doors saying which country is going to want to take there.
Wow, that's a challenge for the future, challenge for the UN is the climate refugees. And Xinmeng, who's our next guest?
Well, let me introduce Winston Ma Wenyan, CEO of China Silk Road Investment.
Thank you.
Winston, you've got 3 books there. Can you tell us what those are? I mean, they look like...
yes.
Just hand those over to me. I want to look at those books. My goodness. We've got... this is the digital economy. And we've got...
This, German.
Wow, it's in German. China's what? The new digital story, technology, and China's mobile economy.
Yes.
You've written all 3 of these books.
That's the 3 years. That's how fast this digital transformation in China has been.
3 years, 3 books.
Yes,
now, aside from writing books, what do you do in your spare time?
Well, I'm the CEO of China Silk Road Investment. This is a new platform established, obviously, with the One Belt, One Road initiative in the background. And until earlier this year, I was one of the managing directors at CIC, China Investment Corporation, China's sovereign wealth fund, focusing on global investments both in China and overseas markets. And the focused areas is digital economy, which to me is the future, both for China and the globe. So it's really great for you to invite me to join the panel today, because on one side, I was born in China a little more than 40 years ago. So I personally experienced the 40 years of China's open reform, and I benefited tremendously from the 40-year open reform myself, right? On the other hand, as we look into the digital economy, digital transformation of the globe, it's very interesting to see China, after 40 years of open reform, has transformed it from an agricultural economy into a manufacturing economy, and now an innovation economy. And through the digital economy, the digital Silk Road into the cyberspace, into the world, actually China is now set itself to be a player of the modern digital transformation, and also can share experience with other emerging markets. Other emerging markets, just like China 40 years ago, to go into the next age of AI and the digital economy.
Now, I remember 40 years ago, we had these telephones that were like this big, and we would have to book a call in China, and in a city like Shanghai,
yes,
you had the old colonial phone system. I mean, the old British section, you couldn't call to the French section. So you had all of these constraints in communication. Now you're telling me that China's going to be leading the globe on the digital Silk Road. That's what your book's about, you know? I mean, that's quite amazing.
Yes, sir.
So that's a huge transformation that you've seen in your lifetime.
That's definitely happening, right? So if we just focus on the 3 years, last 3 years, you see 2016 is the year of mobile internet. So my book, the title was China's mobile economy, mostly focusing on the connectivity, spread of smartphone, so on and so forth, right? So that's those are better phones than the old phones, right? And then 2017, the Chinese version has a new title, Digital Economy 2.0, because in Hangzhou G20 Summit 2016, President Xi and other G20 leadership had the joint announcement to have digital economy as a new growth engine for the for the post-crisis global economy. And the subtle shift is we think broadly into the digital technology more than mobile internet itself. And we think about technology innovation more than internet connectivity itself, right? And then 2018, when we talk about the digital Silk Road, it has a more global flavor, So therefore, if you think about it, 2016 is a time people shifting from traditional phone into smartphone and shifting from phone calls into WeChat calls and other online calls, right? And in 2017, with digital technology improvement, people have much better connections. They're looking to 4G, 5G upgrades. They're looking to video calls. So they can have much more information. And for 2018, as we enter into the age of AI, people have more demand for facial recognition, more voice recognition as they're making phone calls, and probably instant translation as we're making phone calls to the global markets, right? So just for looking at one phone, the last 3 years, there's a lot of change.
Winston, I like this because rather than saying globalization, which has kind of become a overused term, you've kind of come up with a new term here. Post-financial crisis, global, innovative, digital economy. Nicholas, could the UN come up with an acronym for that? I'm sure. Xinmeng, who's our next guest?
Well, let me introduce Matt Harborn, president from the EU Chamber of Commerce in China. Welcome.
Matt, now you've been in China, I think, quite long. I mean, back 26 years or so, is that right?
Altogether, yeah. I came to China first time 1982.
Right.
Yes.
1982. And I remember you were telling me earlier today about a story when you were here at this hotel, the Peninsula Hotel, for its soft opening. You remember that?
Oh, yeah. I have two strong memories from this hotel. First was I was staying here at the soft opening back in 1989. It was a spring, I now recall. My second strong memory is that exactly 26 years ago, on the day, I proposed to my wife in this very hotel.
In this hotel?
Yes.
So by being on our show today, you're bringing back a lot of memories, right?
I do indeed, yes, yes.
And that's why we chose this hotel for our program, because it really in that way symbolizes 40 years of reform and opening in China. Now, you are the chair of the European Chamber of Commerce, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And that must be quite a task, because you have right now all these global trade wars and all these things going on. How are you coping with that?
Well, I think we play a very important role today. I mean, we are a very influential lobby organization in China. We come out with substantial reports every year. This year we produced 3 reports. And for us, we present the picture of China that is a bottom-up description. And we give recommendations to the Chinese government on how to make the business climate better for all business that thrive under open and fair competition. And I think the picture that we give on China should also help foreign policymakers to use the right approach in trying to engage with China in a constructive way.
So as chair of the European Chamber of Commerce, that's a full-time job. But I believe you also have another full-time job. You're actually heading Scania's business here. Is that right? And
yeah.
That's about trucks and cars. And tell me, how much of the trade war is affecting the auto industry? And a question on that is, how much of China investment is already entangled with the international auto industry, so that it's kind of like you can't untangle this thing?
Yeah, I'm heading our Scania China strategic office, so I'm really looking into the future. I'm working with policy, and I'm working with trying to make the transport market here mature. Talking about the automotive market, of course, that is a highly global market with integrated global supply chains. So, of course, the tariff war that we're just in the middle of right now is disrupting our global supply chains. And this is not good, because it's disrupting supply chains that we have built over years, where we have also assured that they are working according to the highest standard of corporate social responsibility. Now companies need to rethink and put production in other areas in order to mitigate the increased costs of tariffs. It's not only affecting the global supply chains, it's also we have global production systems. We produce products in Europe, in the US, in China, and ideally we want to be able to move products between these economies. Now that becomes very difficult and just leads to cost increase, which at the end of the day is passed on to the consumer. So the trade war is quite disruptive. We are not in favor of this kind of measure in order to engage China in its further reform and opening.
So when Trump sits there and says we're going to put tariffs on China and punish them, but he's actually in the end punishing a whole host of industries, including American industries, European allies, because we're looking at a very integrated global economy. Am I correct?
That's correct. And I think there's one other aspect that may be overlooked here, and that is, Winston was just talking about, that China is becoming highly innovative. China has very innovative ecosystems that are emerging very quickly. So for a foreign company, China is now the source of new ideas, new concepts, new products. It's also, of course, a source of disruptive technologies and business models, both at the same time. But for any global corporation, if you're not immersed and engaged in the Chinese ecosystems, you might find yourself sitting on the platform and see the train taking off.
Wow, so it's time to get on that train. And you're with the EU Chamber, you're looking at China from the grassroots up, you're looking at the industry view of China out. But I think our last guest today actually is looking at media, if I'm correct.
Yep. So let me introduce, last but not least, Global Communication Specialist Michael Jordan.
Michael, I believe you've had a vast career as a journalist, as a correspondent from a host of magazines, newspapers covering China, inside, outside. Tell us a little bit about your media career.
Did you say fast career?
Vast career.
Vast.
Vast
career.
career.
Gone by quickly.
Fast career and vast career.
Yes, vast career as well. I mean, I've actually been very fortunate in that I'm an American, but I've lived on 3 other continents, from Europe to Southern Africa, now in China. And so my relationship with globalization is from 4 different continents, but it's also personal and professional in that I've worked for 20 years as a foreign correspondent, also teaching at a number of universities on 4 continents, teaching international journalism, and also now as a communications consultant. But also personally, I'm the father of 3 children, and so even my 2 teenage sons have already lived on 4 continents. So even as a certain family value that I'm teaching my own children is that as I feel myself to be a global citizen, I also want my children to feel comfortable wherever they are in the world, open-minded, respectful, just comfortable in their own skin, and as human bridges wherever they may travel. So that's one of the great advantages of living a globalized life as well.
And what are you doing right now? Are you still a journalist, or are you imparting some of your knowledge to the next generation?
Well, as a journalist, I would say I'm a journalist now in quotation marks, because I'm mostly teaching international journalism to Chinese students in Beijing, in Hangzhou, Shanghai, in the past also in Hong Kong for a number of years. And so I'm leading them through the process of producing international stories in English for an international audience. So I'm working as their editor, as we also then publish their stories on our own webzine, class webzine. So on the one hand, I'm teaching international journalism and communication, global communication skills to smart young Chinese, mostly grad students and undergrads, but also working with some Chinese and international companies on how to reach that international audience, a smart, curious international audience, a certain elite audience, but that's also skeptical in how they consume news and information, especially from China, the world's second largest economy. So also teaching the need for whatever we say, back it up with facts, with evidence. And actually that's, just in listening to my colleagues here, I see that as one of the great challenges that China or all these international organizations face. If you're talking about the threats, the challenges, the issues of whether it's global digitalization or urbanization or trade or development, it's one thing to say this is a problem, this is an issue, or to say great benefits, look how positive. But for a certain audience, the audience we want to reach, we have to work hard to convince them with fact-based, with evidence. It's a real serious evidence regarding outcomes, impact, to show, not tell that audience. Say like with the trade war. It's one thing to say this is bad because, or this is good because. There's that skeptical audience that you're going to have to work hard to persuade, to convince, and to how to show, not just tell them that, with the evidence, but also then to humanize, tell real stories of the benefits of the Belt and Road Initiative, the benefits of this form or that form of urbanization. You know, so the combination of touching the mind with evidence-based communication, touching the heart with real human stories to highlight the shared humanity or universal values that we all have in common.
Michael, I hope you can recommend some of your top students to join us on CGTN as we start to tell the world the facts about what's happening, a balanced perspective, and we start to look at where globalization is going for China and for the rest of the world. Let's watch this video to tell us more.
Globalization is entering a new phase defined by soaring streams of data and information. Digital globalization is affecting every corner of the world. Global flows of all types support growth by raising productivity. Data flows are amplifying this effect by broadening participation and creating more efficient markets. MGI's analysis finds that in over a decade, all types of flows coming together have boosted the world GDP by nearly 10%. That amounted to some $7.8 trillion in 2014 alone, with data flows accounting for $2.8 trillion of that impact. For this year, that number is estimated to be around $8.7 trillion. Trade was once largely confined to advanced economies and their massive multinational conglomerates. Today, a more digital form of globalization has opened the door to developing countries, small companies and startups, and to billions of individuals. Tens of millions of small and mid-sized enterprises worldwide have turned themselves into exporters by joining e-commerce marketplaces like Alibaba, Amazon, and eBay. More than 10% of the global goods trade is conducted through international e-commerce. In fact, even the smallest companies can now compete with the largest multinationals. Digital globalization is one noticeable aspect of overall globalization in the 21st century. AI is gearing up to meld with human life with unprecedented speed. So the question becomes, what are the key reasons behind the fast development of digital globalization in all aspects of life? Will digitalization have the final say in the future?
We're living in a world which is an interconnected matrix. Whether we call it globalization or global connectivity, we're all working closer together and more reasons to collaborate than to find division. And of course, there's no other organization that's got the sort of the burden of this job than the UN. Nicholas, how are you working to bring people together at a time when there's so much divisiveness around the world?
Well, I mean, globalization has, on the one hand, people who say it can do nothing right, and on the other hand, people who have said in the past it's solved all the world's problems. I think somehow the the fact is that globalization has achieved a lot for the world. It's brought many countries, many societies into the global markets. It's lifted many people out of poverty. And basically, it's helped connect the world up. And as I said before, it helps with the agenda of peace and security. But at the same time, I think we also have to recognize that not everyone has benefited from it. Not all countries have been able to enter the world economy, world markets. And within countries, certain groups have lost out. Perhaps their industry has declined and so on. And I think what we've lacked in the past has been the right kind of economic and social policies to help those who have been losing out. I mean, in terms of helping to re-educate, to retool, to invest in sunrise industries as opposed to sunset industries, and so on. So I think that's the global picture on globalization, and it's important that we do look at the social impact and not just the economic impact. And we've seen in China, that it has had an enormous impact. I mean, we're talking about the 40 years of opening up and reform. We've seen 800 million people lifted out of poverty. But importantly for China, they've also invested in social issues. They've invested in health. They've invested in education. We've seen longevity go up 10 years. We've seen infant mortality go down from 35 to 7. And in many ways, China has progressed just as fast in terms of social progress as in terms of economic progress.
In terms of globalization, you're on the forefront of dealing with these issues through the European Chamber. I mean, you must be in constant dialogue with the Chinese government and, of course, dealing with the whole phenomena of decoupling from globalization, Brexit, and, of course, walls going up from Washington. How do you face that challenge, and how will China face it?
I think at the center of the discussion right now is this idea of convergence. When China joined the WTO in 2001, the idea was that would bring convergence between China and the rest of the world, politically, economically. Well, we can say one thing. Economically, China has never, ever been as integrated into the world as it is today, or the world integrated into China. So from that point of view, I think convergence is really happening. And this will continue. This is a tide that cannot be held back. And the question now is, as Nicolas said, to mitigate the negative effects of globalization on countries around the world. The other thing for China is to realize that China is a huge player in the global economy. And what we are seeing now is a Chinese economy that is maturing, becoming more modern, and we see the reforms not quite keeping up with that. And we are talking about a reform deficit. And if that deficit cannot be closed, China will, in a way, feed into those populist movements around the world who are against globalization. So from that point of view, China now has a global responsibility.
Now, in terms of global responsibility, environment is absolutely critical. And with globalization, we do have the fact that there's more CO2 emissions that have taken place as we've had more industrialization. How are you working to cope with that with China? We've got rising seas, disappearing coastlines, disappearing islands. Maldives is going to disappear. What's the forefront of this technology?
I mean, Laurence, if we ever as a species needed a banner to get under and to say we are all united, as the United Nations, it is the environment. It does not respect any borders. Even the notion, I did a talk in Paris where I mentioned the fact that nation states, just that notion is only 350 years old. It goes back to the Westphalia Treaty. Before that, we have migrated for tens and hundreds of thousands of years. We have moved with the weather, and then suddenly, 350 years ago, we've got these blocks. So I think China recognized this. I think in 2015 with the ecological civilization that was very important. I believe you worked on this, and when I read that, I remember thinking to myself, wow, finally, the fact that we have to work in harmony with nature. There's just no way around it. Anybody who says otherwise or who thinks that this is sustainable is not looking at the data. So Michael, you mentioned stories and how important data is. The studies are out there. I mean, this report from 13 federal agencies in the U.S. was published yesterday. It's damning. there's just no question about what's going to happen. The first IPCC report was a huge bomb for us in the Pacific, but then there was a second IPCC report just earlier this year. And when you start looking at the data, it's extremely worrisome. I'm talking about some of these nations in the Pacific, as you said, are actually going to lose their sovereignty. This is going to be another headache, a legal headache for the UN. What do you do with Kiribati? So I met the president and the past prime ministers. They literally are worried that in their lifetime, they'll have to tell their people, so it's 160, 180,000 people, you no longer have a passport, a nationality, so what happens to your culture, your language, your people?
But wait a minute, but aren't you developing these floating cities that are like cells that can be put together? You can actually, address climate or disappearing islands with reappearing technology cities?
We're looking at this from a technology standpoint, but mainly because of the issue of land reclamation. This happens even on small islands like Kiribati, like Tahiti. We have just get into this habit of taking from nature. You'll reclaim, and it just doesn't work. But to your point about these of floating cities being a possibility, it's one of the discussions that's being had at heads of state are starting to discuss. Because right now the UN, the Convention on the Law of the Sea is very specific. If you abandon your country and it's underwater, you are not a country. And it may not sound like a lot, but for the people who actually lose it, it's everything. You buried your great-grandparents there, it's your entire identity. And right now there's a lot of thinking about how you are going to be a citizen of a country that no longer exists.
Wow.
So it's real.
I'd like to add something to that, if I could. That one thing I've learned here in China, of course, the environmental challenge is a huge issue, not just for China, but for the world itself, considering it is the world's most populous nation, world's second largest economy. And one thing I've learned is, of course, understandably, over the decades, most Chinese have been focused on their own economic survival and prosperity. But I do see a growing trend, even through the stories my students produce, a growing trend of more and more Chinese becoming active in terms of being aware of the environmental challenge, more and more NGOs being established, more and more Chinese volunteering for these organizations as university students or as volunteering as professionals when they have time. And what I realize too is, obviously that effort needs to continue. But what I see as well as needed is not just, there are reports online, right? But, and continuous stories. It is a communications challenge ultimately, and I think what's also needed within the communications, within the storytelling, is even a how-to guide. Because if you look at, let's say when I was living in Africa with HIV in Africa, it's an overwhelming problem. What can I do about HIV in Africa? Or air pollution in China. A few days ago, pretty bad air quality. What can I do? But in working with some Chinese environmentalists, this idea of how one person became inspired, awoke to a problem, became active, but then a step-by-step guide as to how they got involved and how you yourself can get involved. And in the US we do have this culture of one person can make a difference. And I think gradually here that's also catching on, but I think more can be done in terms of the communications and the storytelling to
inspire butterfly people. Effect, right?
Yeah, yes. Butterfly effect.
But that's also the discussion we have with the Chinese government. Clearly, China is now moving away from its previous economic development model, which was growth at any price, solving the basic problems of society. Now it's moving into another model which has to be more sustainable and quality-driven. Here we can see that there are white spots in the economy that are unexplored. And I'll give one example. The energy consumption standard of buildings is there, but it's not enforced. If this was strictly enforced, it means that a new industry would be born that would be working with new insulation materials, triple glazing, control system, inspections, and so on. So here we could see a combination of finding new drivers of the economy, whilst at the same time saving on precious energy and creating a better environment. These are the sort of dialogues that we like to engage with the Chinese government about.
So actually we think that environment in itself and preserving the environment could actually be the next economic driver here in China. Is that possible?
I think so, and I think China will also be the source of a number of new innovations. But it requires this combination of a wise government that sets the regulatory frameworks and enforces them, and then gives the industry the freedom to solve problems within that framework. The thing we don't want to see is a government also engaging in setting technological roadmaps. That's up to us, industry, society. But government sets the frameworks and enforces. That is a very nice combination between society and government.
But there's a role for technology, Winston. I mean, the whole environmental, effort depends on technology. And how is China's leapfrog here going to mean a leadership role for China on environment and globalization?
Sure. Let me put some digital dimension, right, to this discussion about globalization and the environment. First of all, let me mention the 4 key words that the G20 Hangzhou Summit used when President Xi and the other leadership highlighted digital economy. They are innovative, invigorated, interconnected, and inclusive. Actually, Laurence, you used the word interconnected earlier as well, right? And to me, the words interconnected and inclusive are really the essence of globalization. So just last week, actually we can use example last week, perfect example, November 11th, the Singles Day. Well, obviously we all know it's the shopping extravaganza in China, $30 billion trade volume in 24 hours, big shopping day for China. But what's really important, it's a global festival as well. Actually on that platform, sellers, buyers, vendors, merchandisers, coming from more than 200 countries participated in this 24-hour shopping festival, right? They all participated in this 30 billion trade volume. And for smaller brands, smaller entrepreneurs, right, and the smaller vendors coming from emerging markets, to be part of this ecosystem is a tremendous thing, right? It's a tremendous thing. Now, if we think about the climate management for emerging markets, remote areas, smaller countries, right? They probably have little data on their climate right now. So through the digital transformation, they may start to have small data on their climate, and gradually they may have big data, and gradually, globally, we may have this ecosystem of shared data, just like a Singles Day. Buyers, sellers from 200 countries participated. We may have this shared data system from more than 200 countries about climate to collectively work on a solution for the climate management.
Wow. So whether it's globalization, addressing the environment, floating cities, data is essential. And if we want to know more about the digital dimension, watch this.
Globalization is challenging traditional cultural values of nations and giving a voice to people from various cultures. It's brought about tremendous changes in the cultural patterns and created a more global culture with the internet, social media, mobile devices and cable TV sweeping away cultural boundaries. The mass media helps sustain unity in an age of globalization. From Hollywood blockbusters to the Korean wave of K-dramas and K-pop shows, to Chinese kung fu films, to Japanese anime, they're watched across the world and known to people in many countries. When you stroll into your local Starbucks, you'll find yourself part of a cultural experience on a scale never seen before. For the first time, your morning cappuccino is the same, no matter whether you sip it in Beijing, New York or Sydney. And of course, it's not just Starbucks. Select any global brands such as Coca-Cola, Nike and Adidas, or social media such as Facebook, Twitter and Weibo, or fast foods like KFC and McDonald's. You will see or feel their cultural presence in most countries around the world. Globalization is bringing increasing interconnectedness to and among different populations and cultures. As the world gets more and more connected, many argue that we are becoming more multicultural and slowly grasping the diversity of human culture. But some are also concerned about whether there will be a single society and culture occupying the whole planet in a globalized world.
From the digital dimension, to sustainable development. We have an incredible lineup of guests today on China reform and opening 40 years in perspective. But today, in our last episode, we're looking 40 years ahead to the future. And of course, they're the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Nicholas, these goals were set for 2030. Yeah. They're quite ambitious. Is any country going to be able to meet these goals? First of all, what are these goals, and how do we get there, and can China play a role?
Well, I mean, the goals are basically about improving well-being for everyone on the planet, but at the same time protecting the planet. Environmental sustainability, social sustainability, and economic sustainability. And we have 17 goals and with targets for each. And these cover every aspect of human development and the planet. They're very ambitious, they're universal, they apply to all countries, and they're comprehensive. They cover everything from industrialization and urbanization to the elimination of poverty worldwide. And we need to work together on these. It's not going to be accomplished if we don't work together as a global community. It needs really strong partnerships and needs really strong efforts to mobilize the financing that's needed. And that's not just about governments, it's not just about traditional aid, it's also about bringing in the private sector and other partners for the financing. And I think here China, we're beginning to see very interesting examples. I mean, financial innovation in China is very strong. We talk a lot about the kind of technological innovation, but on the finance side, we're seeing now talk about SDG bonds being issued by local governments. China already is the largest green finance market in the world. The carbon trading markets have opened already in China. So there's a lot happening in terms of financial innovation where we can look to how not just the public sector from developing countries and developed countries are contributing to the SDGs, but also the private sector. If we can align private sector investments behind the SDGs so they make a financial rate of return, but at the same time the investments are supporting the SDGs and making a social rate of return, then I think we can achieve the SDGs.
So private sector driving toward the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, requiring finance for innovation. Winston, aren't you on the cutting edge of finance for innovation? That's what you do. I mean, that's your career is all about that.
Sure, sure. You know, from the technology perspective, the biggest challenge and the biggest hurdle to global sustainable development is the digital divide. And this is very forward-looking in terms of challenge and hurdle. And it is much more than just digital literacy or just digital access. There are three levels of profound implications, which all requires substantial financing and investments. Number one is the basic, is relatively basic, is the digital connectivity. Right? What's important here is globally we know there's half of the people do not have internet connectivity. And even for China, a country that focuses so much on infrastructure investment, so much focuses on digital transformation, still the overall connectivity rate in China is only about 55%. So that means almost half of the billion population in China has no connectivity. Right? So you can imagine how serious the issue is globally. Right? And then the second aspect of the digital divide is the divide between traditional industries and new economy companies, because digital technologies are disrupting traditional industries. And for China, since we only had 40 years of history of manufacturing industry development with the help of open and reform, many of the industry companies are very vulnerable, right? So going forward, we will see a lot of companies being disrupted by digital economy, and how the issue about how to handle that transition will be a very big issue, because a lot of the industries will need to invest tremendously to make that transformation, and it is not easy, as we have seen in the case of GE, right? And then the third is much more profoundly is the divide. The digital divide between, I would say, people of the AI age and people are not. right? That the people are relevant, and some, maybe you say people who are not relevant, right? And that's a serious social issue, because as artificial intelligence and machine learning become more and more sophisticated, a lot of jobs will disappear. A lot of people who do not have the technology background may be quote-unquote not relevant, right? And if you look globally, then you say maybe it's also possible that all the innovation and technology know-how will be concentrated in a few countries, and the majority of the countries will be not relevant. And this divide will be super profound and significant as a fundamental challenge to the global sustainable growth goal.
This is very Shakespearean, to be relevant or to not be relevant. Are you relevant?
Yeah, we are relevant.
Yes.
I think what China and other developing countries can do is to make technological leapfrogs into the future. That's understandable, and of course companies want to be part of that journey. Yes. But at the same time, countries like China need to lay the foundation. Yes. And if you look at basic skills in the economy, like vocational skills, plumbing, ventilation, water, sewage, and so on. There we see that standards, electricity not to forget, standards are not enforced again as strictly as they could. And if standards are enforced, it will force a new level of vocational training, special tools, special vehicles, inspections. That again is $1 trillion industry. That is a new driver of the economy. So what the Chinese government needs to do, or other governments, is to at the same time work on the top-notch technology leapfrogging and keep laying the foundation. And this is where we want to engage.
Matt just made a tremendous point, and I want to, just like him, focus on this word leapfrog, because in all my books and also in all the media or the newspapers, when they talk about China's transformation, they keep using the word leapfrog, right? But the reality is, as we know, through the 40-year open reform, it's not a leapfrog overnight. No. Because 40 years ago, China was an agricultural economy, right? And through maybe 10, 20 years, by end of 2000, beginning of the new century, joined WTO, China became a relatively, let's say, low-end manufacturing country. And then later, through innovation, China become more up the value chain. And then by 2018, with all the preparation work of manufacturing industry, innovation work, and also financing power, China in 2018 is set to be a player in the future AI and the digital economy, right? So for emerging markets, when they look at this, when they think about the word leapfrog, on one side, yes, it's a tremendous opportunity for them to get into the future AI economy tomorrow. But at the same time, it is also a tremendous challenge to these countries, especially to the countries that do not have the same kind of technology preparation as well as the financing power, to try to make all these several revolution in one jump, right?
Now you've said something, in the 80s China began reform and opening. Yes. By the 90s it became the factory of the world. After the 2008 financial crisis it became
financing power,
the financing power, the central bank of the world. Now I hear you saying that China is going to be the technology leader of the world. Nicholas saying that it's actually going to be leading on multilateralism and going forward to our sustainable development goals. Yes. And you're telling me it's going to be the ecological leader of the world. So tell me, what's the future in China? You're covering media. Is China going to be leading on media as well? Will CGTN be the global media platform? Tell us.
Well, for me, that's a separate issue, I guess. Can I just respond with one point to Winston's point about the technology? And I'd be happy to talk about the medias. I appreciate your enthusiasm for the technology and the advances. And much of the world is very excited as well. I mean, certainly here in China, the idea of being able to pay with everything through my phone and not finding that in the US or in Europe, that sort of thing is really, it's a marvel. It is. On the other hand, I see this rising anger. Sure. It's called populism, but rising anger. that I see in America, I see in Europe and in Africa, here in China too. And when we talk about turning everything, automatizing and robotizing everything, that sort of thing, there is a lot of anxiety. So we don't talk much, I think, about the human dimension. Just this basic question of, okay, technology, great, but is it really? How is it really in concrete ways? How has it enhanced our lives? There's a lot of nuance to the story, better or for worse. I mean, I see with my own children a certain degree of addiction to the electronic devices and how that affects their communication skills or what have you, right?
I think the humanity aspect of China would be a very important case study for the world as we look into the future, let's say this shared digital future, right? Because you talk about the data issue, you talk about the social issue. For all these, China probably will be the best lab. Probably will be the best lab, right? We talk about the global connectivity. China has 500 million people who do not have internet access. How do we reach the last mile, right? That's a big case study. Second, about industry disruption. China has very short history of industrialization. How are they going to handle it? That's a big case study. And from a social aspect, right? China has the largest population, 1.4 billion, and it's so fast aging. So in terms of how to deal with the middle-aged people who lost their jobs, or looking at the aging people who are not very well prepared for the all digital world, like you said, paying everything in mobile payment, then they may not be fully prepared. Now, how do we prepare the society? So I think China will be the best case study, or the largest case study, for all these social issues and the humanity issues that you are very concerned about.
Laurence, I think Winston has been very modest when he says China could. I think as far as AI, this is a subject I'm fascinated by, because if you're creating a new city, you have to think about the society and how you run it. So AI has been top of mind for a few years.
Right.
And I've had the chance to talk about this with Dr. Kai-Fu Lee, who I'm sure you know about. And I think he's the one who said something like, well, if AI is the new oil, then China is the new Saudi Arabia. And the fact
which I do not agree. But,
but to your point about the digital divide and preparing, I think it isn't just about skills. I really think, if you look at Silicon Valley, I spent a lot of time between New York and Silicon Valley. If you talk to just about any CEO of these companies, for them it's very clear, whether you talk to Elon Musk, whether you talk to Mark Zuckerberg, you talk to Peter Thiel, for them they see the future very clearly as one where AI and automatization has actually taken away a lot of the burden. If you look at the word automaton, it came from, I think it's German originally, and it was about taking away hard labor. I mean, we think of AI as being this very fancy thing, but ask your wife if she would like to wash clothes without a washing machine. A washing machine is AI in a way, right? It's very simple that you put clothes in, but what did that do? The fact that women had a machine that washed the clothes meant that they had time to read to their children, and it changed educational patterns and everything. So I don't think we're prepared, any country is prepared for what's happening. And everywhere I go, I try to ask. I mean, the Vatican is having discussions about this. The UN is having discussions about the ethics about AI. The car manufacturers, will the car choose to turn left and kill 3 people as opposed to the owner of the car? I can see Mercedes having a problem with that. You know, so I think, you know, you asked us, Laurence, to think about what's the future of, you know, in the next 40 years for China. I don't think anybody can see that far. I mean, I can't imagine what 40 years of China is going to look like. It's been so fast, Laurence. I mean, so fast.
Let's just look right around the corner at something that's going to revolutionize everything. There's all this talk about 5G. Now, Winston, can you explain this? I mean, are we going to be able to, like, get out of our office and press our phone and have the washing machine go on, and then have a robot walk the dog, and what's going to happen? I mean, tell me.
Yes, yeah. 5G represents the 5th generation, right? Mostly related to the networks that we get our data from, where we use data for video streaming or phone, making video calls with our families. So what's the 5G network, which is set to come in a few years? As we know, like Huawei is among the ambitious group of companies that predict that we will have 5G in a year or two, and they promise that we will have more than 1,000 times faster connectivity and data flow than the fourth generation, which means we can download one movie, one of the Laurence movie, in 1 second and watch it, right? And probably it can lead to cheaper access to internet activity in some areas. So it will be a tremendous revolution, because with faster speed, we will not only see just pure speed, but also see higher data analytical capabilities, which may lead us to more revolutionary growth in AI and machine learning.
I have a question for Nicholas. Now, with AI and robots taking on such a significant role in our decision making, will they be represented at the UN? I mean, will the robots, I mean, before people are making the decisions, will artificial intelligence be making the decisions at the UN? What do you think?
Well, I think not. I think at the end of the day, there's a level in society where human judgment will still be needed, and there's a certain normative dimension in making decisions that would still need a human touch. Whether how AI fits into kind of global governance, I'm not sure. I mean, these are the mega trends that really we haven't been studying enough from an ethical point of view, I think. But there's a lot of things here which I mean, we've been talking about. I mean, in terms of technology, in terms of the economy, in terms of globalization, and trying to see how they all intersect with each other over the next 40 years is fascinating. And I think we've touched on some of these issues. You mentioned demographics. And certainly in China, if you just go ahead to 2040, there'll be 250 million more people aged over 50 in the same size population. The median age will be 47. So it won't be a young population anymore. And what does that mean for the current investments in science and technology? Will this actually make it easier to adapt to a society with AI, or more difficult? I don't know. I mean, but it's interesting to look at these kind of issues. And then what are the kind of investments we need? I mean, it'll have to be in urbanization. I mean, new kinds of housing for people who are older and living longer. It'll have to be looking at healthcare systems. I mean, how does one ensure that the right healthcare systems are in place? With less routine work, at least, even if decision-making ultimately is with humans, I mean, routine work will definitely go. I mean, do we need to look at things like universal basic income? We've started doing some studies on that, both globally and here in China. But there's so much research that needs to be done, and not just in silos one by one, but how they all interlink with each other. And I think it'll be a fascinating few years ahead.
I'm going to tell you a secret. CGTN is now working on a Laurence Brahm hologram. So the next 40 episodes, there'll be another anchor, and I'm going to be in Tahiti hanging out or checking out the ecological city you're going to be building in Shenzhen. Is that right?
It depends. We were looking, one of the reasons I'm here in China is, you had mentioned that there's buildings that are more, not only environmentally friendly, but energy. Do you know that one of the top companies in the world is not European, it's actually Chinese? Oh, yeah. So I'm visiting them. They have a factory in Changsha, and I think every Chinese has seen this building that went up 30 stories in 15 days. Absolutely cutting-edge, brand-new technology that the world needs to adopt. So I think part of the reason for companies like my own and others coming to China is actually not because it's cheaper to manufacture, but because there is innovation. And so if you have public policy that allows you these big dreams, and which we're seeing even with AI, the reason AI is doing so well in China, and there's a big debate, Dr. Kai-Fu Lee says the US innovates and creates the algorithms, but China implements them and actually uses them because of the deep data sets, very large data sets. But policy, it really always comes down to policy.
You were talking about this before, public policy with big ideas and visions and trying to getting things done. Give us some insights.
No, I think it's like this, that with the new technologies, we will certainly continue to create wealth. So I think we need to harness innovation through policy, to making sure that policy creates compliance and level playing fields, because that forces us to be innovative within certain frameworks. That's one thing. Then given that there is wealth creation, what I'm lacking today, and where we need to have much more of a conversation, is a political vision for how do we ensure the human quality of life, the human aspect in life. And I don't see that discussion happening as much as it should on the political level. And that is crucial for us to guide our technologies and ethical considerations, and above all, sustainability.
Do you mean here specifically in
China? I mean in general, globally, absolutely.
No, we're having the discussion on CGTN. We discuss everything here. But what about the global media? I mean, is there enough of this discussion? We tend to hear the same things over and over again, and China's always being depicted in kind of a old-fashioned way. We had a very heated discussion about this yesterday, about whether China's getting a fair shake in the global media or not. And we're talking about technology, environment. That's the discussion today. Tell me, as a journalist, how do you see it?
Well, I do see great challenges. I mean, I have noticed, of course, that the government has invested heavily, billions within Chinese television, within Xinhua, into its bureaus around the world, recognizing the importance of communications and telling the story. This is something when I first came into contact with China 10 years ago, I began to hear this lament that we must do a better job of explaining China to the world. And even living in Africa and seeing that, one of my great revelations there was just seeing Chinese all over Africa, even in the tiny African kingdom where we are living, a sizable Chinese community, that sort of thing. So I see some important trends here that's not just reporting the news, but also features humanizing, put a human face on China as on the Chinese as a form of soft power as well, to disseminate Chinese culture and traditions, more documentaries, that sort of thing. But I see that there are certain communication challenges here, which is not only is China the world's most populous nation, but also the largest market of English learners, something like 300 million or so I saw, 300 million Chinese trying to learn English. And, but it's not enough to speak English. It's also about to communicate effectively, especially written skills, whether it's through an organization's website, a company's website, a government agency's website. But also, let's say for CGTN, is to visualize who exactly our audience is and how to most effectively tell the story or convey information. And it goes back to what I mentioned before, the need for, if we have respect for that audience, that they're not following sheep-like, that how to persuade them with credible, transparent evidence, how to put a human face on those stories. It's something that's, look, I know the Chinese have a long, deep tradition of storytelling, their own traditions. I can respect that, but now we're talking about there has to be some flexibility. We need to learn to tell the stories in the way the market, the global market, is accustomed to consuming. Especially when we're talking about, we're not talking about any ordinary audience, we're talking about audience like these folks, okay? It's thinking through who exactly the audience is. We're all coming from countries where we know that not everyone cares about international affairs or China specifically. Lots of people just care about their own, themselves, their families, their communities, cities, countries, and that's it. That's fine. There are a lot of internationally minded folks, okay, many of us and in our circles, who know how important China is to the world in every way that matters, right? Technologically, economically, environmentally, diplomatically, militarily, every single way that matters, China matters. So, but then I also see that the spectrum of those people who care, either they are pro-China, they love China for some reason, probably some good reasons. There's, on the other end of the spectrum, those who may hate China for some reason. There's little that can be done, little if anything that can be done to sway those two. But then there's a group in the middle, I think. Fair-minded, smart, curious, skeptical, fair-minded. Go ahead, show me, don't just tell me that China's making progress, doing some good in the world. There was just an interesting example yesterday, actually. I woke up this morning reading the story. There was a serious terrorist attack in Pakistan. Specifically having to, according to the attackers, 4 killed in Karachi. Specifically, they said it's about the Belt and Road, what the Chinese are doing in Baluchistan. I'm not an expert on Pakistan. I don't know what the real motivations are. And of course, any sort of killing, murder is wrong. But I can imagine that the Chinese reaction would be, I mean, first of all, they expressed shock, and they said the investment will continue. Fine. But if any fair-minded person says, well, are you doing good in Pakistan? You can't just say, we're doing wonderful things. Trust us. Believe us. Investment and trade is a wonderful thing. They have to work hard. If it's the New York Times correspondent in Beijing, are they doing good deeds in Pakistan? If it's the Pakistani media, if it's in New York, London, Paris, wherever it may be, there's that very influential, what you're calling influencers, the key opinion leaders and all that, who are, if you can convince me that this is a good thing, then I think you can win the argument. But unless you recognize how to communicate that effectively, you're not.
That communication is important, yes.
Yeah, and I would say exactly that part of the present tariff war between the US and China is about, I would say, poor communication coming out of China on its very important initiatives. The China Manufacturing 2025 and the Belt and Road Initiative, both being hugely important initiatives, but could have been communicated in a much better way to explain what are the benefits to China and to the world. And also in these two initiatives and in the communication, being a bit more humble about the shortcomings and recognizing that, okay, we've seen that we pushed in the wrong direction, we go back, reevaluate, we want to include the world in the success of such initiatives. How can we go about it? That kind of communication is very important.
To be fair, President Trump is also not the model communicator as well, since he said, it's bad, it's terrible, we're being ripped off. And then the journalists will say, Mr. President, some evidence, please, to back that up. Trust me. And only his supporters buy that, not the majority.
Can I comment, why I disagree with the statement that data is the oil of the future and China is the Saudi in the future? Yeah, because that's the example of bad communication too, right? Because clearly data is not the same like oil for two very important reasons. One is data is recyclable. Oil is not. Actually, the more you use data, the more data you have. Right? Secondly, actually more importantly, data, when they put together, actually generate more usage, right? Become more valuable. So when you have sharing, joint venture, actually you get more value out of it. You don't get the same from oil, right? So with these two aspects, we should rethink about that term. Said the data is the oil of the future, or some say data is the oil of the AI, because this will lead people to think, okay, the data will feed AI research, and the AI capabilities will define geopolitical superpower. So therefore, data issue becomes a geopolitical tension issue, right? This is not something we wanted to look into, but rather we should think about the good things about data, right? You can keep using it, you get more of the data, and when you put them together, you can have better use of them, and then to use that for all the important issues that we all talked about, like climate, talking about the aging population management, right? Talking about education, so on and so forth. That's the right narrative. So that's why I disagree with the term. And I think we should stop using the term that data is the future of is the oil of the future.
So data, is it the future?
Point well taken. Point well taken. It's better than oil.
I'll come up with a sort of Zen saying: is the teacup half full or half empty? I think, Winston, you said something before. Are you digitally connected, or are you digitally unconnected? Is the teacup half full or half empty? Let's find out more watching this.
The relationship between globalization and human advancement is undeniable. The driving force behind global development are the contacts and exchanges between peoples and cultures. Without globalization, there can be no civilized exchanges, so progress is disrupted. But from the Silk Road and the voyages to the New World, to economic integration and both information and digital globalization, these exchanges are made possible and global development thrives. So by sustaining these exchanges, we are effectively driving globalization. Which begs the questions, how can we improve the quality of these exchanges? And is the world dependent on globalization?
China, reform and opening, 40 years in perspective, and today we're trying to look 40 years into the future and see what the future holds for all of us with China. The story is sometimes not told clearly, and we're going back to the Belt and Road. When I first heard Belt and Road, a lot of people said to me, this is about a car commercial. I mean, one belt, one road. But now, actually, it's about a cyber Silk Road, a digital Silk Road. It's about an ecological Silk Road. And facing the Belt and Road is the crisis of a trade war. What's going to happen? Is that going to be a disruptive technology to the Belt and Road?
The what?
The trade war.
No, I don't see that connect. If we start with a trade war, I think that's rather an issue of trying to understand what's happening in China. Of course, we agree with the Americans that the foreign companies are exposed to discrimination, there is IPR issues, there's been issues of forced tech transfer, and so on, market access issues. The question is the Chinese government leadership committed to improving these issues and to more opening up and reform? Our evidence from the bottom up is that that is the case. Is it happening quickly enough? No, but the trend is moving in the right direction. Now, the question that we ask ourselves is, can there be a deal, a quick deal in this respect? Because what is the deal? Most of the issues we see that need to be dealt with by the Chinese side are structural issues. And then you need to trust that China is serious about dealing with these trust issues. And I will take two examples. One is reforming the SOEs. Much is happening already. Do we trust that China is serious about doing this? Well, it will take several years before the SOEs are reformed and are acting as full market players with independent profit and loss statements and balance sheets. The other issue is the forced tech transfer. This summer, China issued a State Council document number 19, where it stated that no Chinese government official can force any foreign company to get their technology in exchange for market access. Now the question, do we trust this? Because apparently this is now state policy. Maybe it's happening locally because of local interest, local protectionism, whatever. So in our view, we need to now separate what is state policy and what is practice on the ground. And the question, what is the most efficient way to deal with such malpractices that is happening against what now is stated to be state policy? That is the sort of engagement we would like to see as the business community between the rest of the world and China. And here, confrontation is not the most efficient way forward.
But do we trust Donald Trump? And he's trying to create confrontation. Is that going to polarize rather than try to solve problems?
I think it's polarizing. Perhaps the good thing of Mr. Trump's attitude towards China is that it puts attention to what I talked about earlier, that if China is not reforming quickly enough, which it should do for its own needs, it will play into political forces that go against the interest of globalization and hence the interest of China.
Now I'm going to ask a question to all of you, because we're looking at the Belt and Road, and then of course we're looking at trade war, sanctions. America has sanctions against Russia, against Iran. A lot of Europe wants to trade with Iran. Europe has natural trading relations with Russia. Is this actually pushing the Belt and Road closer together? And are we looking at almost a bifurcated world order in which you have those countries decoupling from globalization and a new amalgamation of global interconnectivity that would be the cyber Silk Road or ecological Silk Road? Or I'd like all of you to just sort of jump in and give me your thoughts. Nicholas, you seem to have a startled look on your face. So what does the UN have to say about this?
No, I don't think so. I mean, most countries have multiple connections, multiple trading relations, and the Belt and Road is an extremely important one, but is adding to a mix of existing global trading relations, and I don't think it's replacing them or competing with them. I think there is potential complementarity. I mean, the UN Secretary General said about the Belt and Road, it has potential to be an accelerator for the Sustainable Development Goals. And we want to work closely with the destination countries and with China to make that vision a reality. And that means to ensure that the investments are financially sustainable, that they're very importantly environmentally sustainable, using clean technologies, and they're socially sustainable, benefiting the population groups in the destination countries. So we're certainly looking to cooperate with China and with the destination countries to make these things happen in the future.
Are your floating cities going to be sustainable? I mean, people are going to ask, you know, you're going to have these in the ocean. I mean, how is it going to work with the ecology?
The whole point of proposing the solution is sustainability. It's a reaction to what we already are doing in terms of urbanization and land reclamation. Land reclamation is bad not only for where you do it, but where you take the sand. So it's terrible, terrible. And the UN did a study in 2014 about sand scarcity. We're running out of sand, if you can believe, something that's free, so in the commons. 3 countries already have banned sand exports to Singapore. Singapore is the largest purchaser of sand for land reclamation. About 25%, 22% of Singapore has been reclaimed. 3 of their neighbors have stopped sending sand. One of the neighbors lost 23 islands, islands that had, you know, not populations, but that were, you know, on the map, and they're no longer on the map because of sand extractions. So the other figure that is just staggering is the rate of urbanization in China. This is a figure that a lot of people have a hard time grasping, is that in 3 years, I think it was 2008 to 11, something like that, China consumed and laid down as much concrete as the United States did in the 20th century. So this is, I mean, just, I don't know what, it was 12 gigatons or something, but it's more because of this need to urbanize. But today, there's a recognition that this is not sustainable. You can't give everybody the exact same life, so you really need to rethink, and that's what I think is extremely exciting about China, is that the scale, the 1.4 billion you're talking about, forces you to think almost on a global scale. You know, 1.4 billion is almost, you know, we're not far. So I think it's very interesting for any country to look at what China's doing and to say, okay, they're actually we're trying to solve some issues for everybody. You had mentioned earlier the fact, and Sustainable Development Goals speak to that, is the solution has to be for 100% of the people. And it's not just about GDP and growth, it's how is this going to work? And all of the indicators, you look at any indicator, and it just isn't sustainable. If you look at 100,000 years of population growth, it's flat for 100,000. And then in the last 20, it goes up like a hockey stick. Consumption of food, production of arable land. I mean, all of the indicators are saying we better be really, really smart. I think that's what I'm looking for, and that's why I'm fascinated by what China's doing. And I think a lot of the thinking, and there's deep thinking in this country, whether it's the think tanks, whether it's some of these companies that are at the cutting edge. And I think that's what China has to offer the world, is some, I mean, it goes back almost to philosophy, right? You almost have to go back to thinking as a philosopher king and saying, okay, I've got all these, we're running out of food, we're running out of this, how do we balance it? Less food? Better food? Food that's grown in labs. Yeah, I mean, look at Tencent. So Tencent grew out of a tech company in China. They're doing contests now in Rotterdam at the university for agriculture. And I think Microsoft won the contest, but basically Tencent funded a contest to find out how we're going to grow food inside a fully robotic greenhouse. So it plants the seeds, it uses AI for the lighting, for the water, for the soil quality, and suddenly but that's Tencent in Europe figuring out food. So I think it's just fascinating.
I think that Europe was a very important player in China evolving its ecological civilization policy because of the very strong sustainable development, green principles in Europe, but also because Europe had advanced technology which in collaboration with China you could suddenly scale and drop prices and make renewable energy, you know, a home commodity. I mean, tell us a little bit about that.
The good thing about Europe and China is that we've had a number of dialogues, policy dialogues, talking about the good experience of Europe, how to build a sustainable, livable society. And exactly as you say, we have lots of good technologies in Europe that can be scaled up in China. Many actually are developed in municipalities. For example, how to use biogas to run city buses. Well, if you can scale that up for China using wastewater sludge as the primary source of fuel to generate biogas for the whole of China, it's enormous environmental benefits and no CO2 emissions, basically. So here's a good complementarity.
And you've been talking about youth, and a big chunk of the ecological civilization policy has been an investment in getting youth to have values of ecology and also the technological training that's involved in this huge transformation. What's your first-hand experience?
That's not exactly my expertise, but I do have a certain insight into the youth in terms of having now taught well over 1,000 Chinese grad students.
What do they feel? What do they think?
I mean, look, one thing that jumps out to me is just how they are now, individually, they are human bridges to the outside world through their English speaking skills, English writing skills. They're increasing, well-traveled. Many of my students at Renmin University from last semester are now out in the world on internships for CCTV and Xinhua, China Daily, that sort of thing. And so in terms of globalization, that's one thing that excites me, that they are out in the world, able to humanize the other, bring that back into the people they meet, then humanize, hey, I know a nice young Chinese person, all that. And so this idea of increasingly, building more of these bridges, these human bridges. But one thing I did want to say about the Belt and Road, moving forward, you had asked about that, is, as I understand it, the Belt and Road has been going on now for well over 5 years, right? There's already a track record. So I appreciate such phrases like, peace and prosperity, or Chinese values of harmony and cooperation, that sort of thing. But as Nicholas knows well, and Matt's, that governments are essentially thinking about their own self-interest. And individuals in these countries are also thinking about their own self-interest. So I think moving forward for the Chinese to highlight if there have been successes, if there have been some positive results and outcomes, how to effectively highlight that. If it's been a mixed bag, how honest, if at all, to be about the shades of, it's not black and white, but shades of gray. But then also how effectively can you hit on the self-interest of different countries to join in or not? Why should we? Why should those societies join in? Because we have to acknowledge that there is that deep skepticism, if not suspicion, of it's not just Chinese motives, American motives when they invest, or European motives when they invest heavily here or there. What's in it for them? So yes, going back to communications and how to effectively bring that to light and persuade vast segments of society to be on board.
Communications. What about this quantum communications that China is working on? Winston, can you give us some insight into this? Is this the future?
Well, this is a big topic, right? This is a big topic because as we all heard about this term Moore's Law, essentially, every year, every twice year, the intensity of circuits, communications efficiency will improve, right? That's the law from Silicon Valley. And as we had a 30 years run of Moore's Law, we are reaching almost the physics limit of chips production, right? So therefore, the quantum computing is viewed as almost like the quantum leap of the Moore's Law for next generation computation, right? And if we get into that quantum computing, almost everything related to computers will be changed, right? Because the computation power will be increased so much more that all the things we know, all the rules we know probably will not apply. But at the same time, it's also very significant. It will be a necessity for AI development because right now our brain is still a lot more like a multi times more sophisticated than the most advanced computer we have right now. So therefore, in some ways, Moore's Law is too slow to upgrade the computation power. So we need quantum computing to have to prepare for us for the age of AI.
So we're still smarter than computers right now.
That's a relief.
We have hope, right?
Yeah.
And now, we're coming to the end of our show, and this has been 40 years of reform and opening, but now we're looking ahead to the future. So in conclusion of our 10 episodes, I would like to ask each of our guests to be the prophet, to look at the future and tell us what China is going to look like in the future. So, should we begin with you, Michael? Tell us, what's the future?
First of all,
you've seen the future, and does it work?
Journalists always get into trouble when they look into their crystal ball. Yeah, we were talking about this before. Who's going to look foolish by predicting the future? It's something I haven't thought about too much, but I only imagine great challenges, because especially my students and the stories they produce, seeing so much of the nuance. For every positive development, there's something negative about it. For every negative trend, there's something positive. And, just even a couple days ago, it was Thanksgiving in the U.S., and so it is important to sometimes be reminded, despite whatever challenges people are facing and hardship and frustrations, to remind them of the benefits of globalization as well. I mean, one thing that I've noticed in China as well that I don't think gets much attention is, for example, the advances in healthcare, medical treatment. For example, some of these ideas, like there's now Alcoholics Anonymous, there's now greater awareness and services for autistic children. There's more palliative care for children and families suffering from cancer. And many of these ideas are because Chinese professionals went to international conferences or studied abroad, or they have now these networks. So these I see as some really positive trends, despite concerns about negative global cultural influences here, whether it's pornography or whatever it may be. Also to look at some of the positive trends for how China's evolving and modernizing.
Matt, the future, have you seen it? Does it work?
Well, I think that the rise of China is inevitable. However, I don't think the ride will be easy. It will be very bumpy. And I think at the center of that ride are the two principles from the third plenary session, the people-centered development and market forces playing the decisive role in resource allocation. Because I think going forward, the focus has to be on the quality of life of China's citizens, including its environment and so on. But in order to achieve that quality of life, China needs a strong economy. A strong economy does not come unless resource allocation is done in the most efficient way. And I think these two principles will be driving policy for Chinese policymakers, government, in the coming decades. And I believe for our own sake, as the rest of the world, we need to engage in exactly that discussion, how to create quality life and how to create a much more efficient economy. I think this is the main theme going forward. That's the future as I see it.
Mark, are we all going to be living on floating cities one day? What does the future look like? The coastlines of Bangladesh, Africa, the islands. Will China be a leader on technology, on ecological technology, exporting floating cities to the world, or flying cities next? What's the future? Are you going to work on drone cities next?
I'm sure there's this. I remain pretty optimistic, even though as you were saying, Michael, about technology having two sides, but that's something that is very, people are debating it today, they're looking at it. But my optimism about the future of China, I think, comes from its youth. If you look at its 400 million millennials, more than any other group in the world, 400 million young Chinese who are more open on the world than any other. So I count on that generation that understands. I mean, you can talk to some of your students, they understand American pop culture, the TV shows and what's going on. What I'd like to see in the next 40 years is that the rest of the world understands China as well as China understands the world. But in terms of, I think we will solve, I think the fact that we have climate change that is so severe and that's front of mind for everyone, whether it's sea level rise, whether it's the mega storms, whether it's the forest fires, I think that forces us to really sit down and think it through. And I'm seeing very positive signals here in China about the future. So whether it's floating cities or other types of urbanization, we haven't changed the way we build cities. I mean, concrete, we were discussing this earlier, concrete was invented reinforced concrete in 1860. I mean, you talk about Moore's Law, there hasn't been a Moore's Law in the way we build cities. But what if China became the world leader in how people live well together? That means the schools, a lot of the people I talk to about cities, we want to live in cities where you can walk anywhere within 15 minutes. The store, the shops, the work, the leisure, So I think we're going to redefine, I think China is at the center. Look at smart cities, this term that's been used, overused, architects hate it, but that whole movement of smart cities, 1,000 around the world, plus or minus, 500 are in China. So I think that's one of the parts where I see a lot of leadership coming out of China, is how are humans going to live together peacefully and in harmony with nature? And if we can solve that, I think we'll be in a better place.
Mark, you've seen the future, and it sounds like it's going to work. Nicholas, UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, will China be able to achieve those goals, and will my hologram have representation of the UN?
No, it won't. But, I mean, on your hologram, I mean. But I think 2030 is just around the corner, and China thinks long-term. And so let's look beyond 2030 even, and look at 2058 or 40 years hence. I would agree with Matt. I mean, development is not just about economic performance. A strong economy is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And I look forward in 40 years' time in China to, yes, it'll have a strong economy. It'll be the biggest economy in the world. I think the per capita income will be very high. It'll be a wealthy economy. But more than that, I look forward to it being a low-carbon society, a society where no one is left behind, where some of the challenges we see currently of inequality and unbalanced development are dealt with. And I think to get to there are some mega trends that need to be taken care of. I think one is climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report is horrifying for the future of humanity. And it's not just about China, it's about all the member states in the UN having to do more. And we need to make sure that we adapt renewable energy, that we look at much greener supply chains and production, and in terms of consumption, we also look at sustainability in terms of consumption. So I think this mega trend on climate change is vital, and we've heard from everyone about that. Second, I think it's the demographics. Which will come first? Will China be rich first or old first? And we need to see how that plays out. And then finally, I think it is about leaving no one behind. I mean, development is not just about the successful people in a society, but it's about how you treat the less successful, those excluded, those who are vulnerable. And I hope that will be taken care of as China progresses.
And Winston, you are the prophet of technology, and you've talked about the digital Silk Road. So are we all going to be connected up by this digital Silk Road? What do you see?
Yes, yes. You know, we talk about 2030, and that's a very easy prediction for me to make, because China has determined it to be an AI superpower by 2030, and it's already written in government policy. So I make that prediction. Yeah. But the relevant point here, as we reflect on 40 years open reform, is that globally, most of the countries are keen to make this digital transformation. But as we discussed before, this concept of leapfrogging could be a opportunity, but at the same time more likely to be a challenge to emerging markets, right? And I think that's where the digital Silk Road will play a very big role. Just like China made its transformation through the 40 years of open reform, going forward in the age of digital economy, China could very well be a experience sharing party, as a digital infrastructure constructor, and more importantly, digital ecosystem partner for many markets, right? So in 2030, we will see a more interconnected world.
All right, and Xinmeng, back to you. 40 years ahead, will you be the host on the show of 80 years of reform and opening with my hologram?
Well, I'm looking forward to a new show, 80 years of China's reform and opening up.
That's right. And now this is the conclusion of our series of China, Reform and Opening, 40 years in perspective. And with our guests, we've been looking ahead 40 years into the future. And over this program of 10 episodes, we've covered political, economic, technological changes, distribution of wealth gaps, We've looked at multilateralism, trade, youth trends, and now the future. And the question is the China teacup half full, half empty, digitally connected or disconnected? Will you be connected to China and the future? Stay connected. Keep watching CGTN. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us.